Hey, it's Todd, and I'm going to talk about encounters and 5th edition, specifically on the working with the adventuring day and the advice given to game masters in the DMG about that adventuring day and what it means for encounters and your players' power and ability economy. So here we have the DMG, and I'm going to start here because I think it's fairly important to, when talking about encounters, to see how they actually define what an encounter is. So I'm on page, looks like 81 of the book, and here we have creating encounters. I'm just going to read this 3 intro paragraphs because I think they're fairly important. So it says, encounters are the individual scenes in the larger story of your adventure. First and foremost, an encounter should be fun for the players. Second, it shouldn't be a burden for you to run. Beyond that, a well-crafted encounter usually has a straightforward objective as well as some connection to the overarching story of your campaign, building on the encounters that precede it while shadowing encounters yet to come. An encounter has one of 3 possible outcomes: the characters succeed, the characters partly succeed, or the characters fail. The encounter needs to account for all 3 possibilities, and the outcome needs to have consequences so that the players feel like their successes and their failures matter. Okay, so looking at these, just this part of the, just their kind of overall definition, is an encounter doesn't have to mean combat. An encounter can be anything. Really, I was actually a little bit surprised when I went back to read this, kind of prepping for recording this video, that they define encounters so broadly. Um, so basically, they're saying an encounter is any individual scene. I usually think of it as something where the players have the potential to act, which I suppose would be every scene. I think my differentiator is if you have a scene that's just them listening to somebody, or some other kind of passive thing, I wouldn't necessarily call that an encounter. Um, but obviously, if they always have the potential to act, which they always should, then yeah, I guess every individual scene is an encounter. Now, they go over some sample objectives here, and these I think maybe a little bit, or rather, maybe I wish that they would have picked a more varied set, because once you read through these, and I'll go through them, they really seem to indicate a lot of combat, which is maybe where people get the takeaway that, which I'll get to in a minute, about how many encounters you should have in a day and how impossible that is to run as combat encounters. So they say that everyone should have an objective and consequences. And in this paragraph, they're going to talk about the objectives and that they should know what those objectives are. I'm going to shift over a little bit so we can see that everyone. Oops, see there. There we go. And so they give you some samples. So one of them, make peace. The characters must convince 2 opposing groups or their leaders to end a conflict that embroils them. Okay, protect an NPC or object. Act as bodyguards, protecting someone or something. And then I'm not going to go through all the complications they list, but we can obviously easily come up with them. Retrieve an object, run a gauntlet. So retrieve an object, basically going through and getting something from some sort of dangerous area, and then run a gauntlet, which is basically just get through a dangerous area, sneak in, stop a ritual, take out a single target. So when you look at these, sneak in isn't necessarily combat. Run a gauntlet doesn't have to be combat. Take out a single target is obviously combat. Stop a ritual probably will have combat involved. If we're protecting an NPC or object, that will probably have combat. So, and retrieve an object doesn't have to have combat, but at least half of these are maybe combat oriented. And so I can see where you get the idea that, hey, they're really kind of hinting towards combat. Now, where this kind of comes into play is in a couple of pages right over here when they talk about the adventuring day, which is they talking about an assumption of the rules that typical adventuring day consists of 6 to 8 medium or hard encounters. So if you read those as everything being combat, then that's a lot of combat. And particularly as characters advance and gain power, then the encounters get more complicated, and enemies have more health, and the players have more health and more abilities. Combats can get long, and unless you're running, I mean, when I was back in college, we would run 8 or 9 hour sessions, but unless you're running something like that, a whole full Saturday worth of gaming, you're not going to get through 6 to 8 encounters if you look at them simply as combat encounters. But I believe, and I feel, and the point of this video is really to look at how to introduce encounters that are outside of combat. And combat may be an outcome of an encounter. For example, if you're looking just at these samples and you do sneak in, well, what's your failure to sneak in? If you fail that objective, is probably going to be some sort of combat. So where this all comes into play when they talk about the adventuring day is people refer to it kind of as an economy, which is your players managing their abilities. And in 5th edition and in 4th edition before that, abilities have different recharge levels. Some on short rests, some on long rests, which equates back to the 4th edition concept of the daily encounters, or daily powers, and the encounter level powers. And it's a big issue for GMs when they're planning encounters, is how to work with their players' resources, how to make sure that they don't necessarily have their full arsenal of powers at every encounter. Because when they have their full arsenal of powers, it makes planning challenging encounters more difficult, because they could just nuke everything with their highest damage, highest, power spells or abilities they have. And it's hard to keep up with that. And when they can do that for every encounter, it makes challenging them very difficult. So you want to force players to budget their powers. And this is something that's gone back to in different versions since the original game. It's that resource management. You have a limited number of, be it torches or spells or food, and you have to manage that throughout your particular adventure, throughout a day, throughout a campaign, right? I only have 3 spell slots. I can't just fire them whenever I need them because I'll run out. I can't just fire one every round. So I need to think about when I'm going to use this one. I'm going to hold on to that one. Hopefully I'll have a chance to use it, because if I don't, it was wasted. I got to kind of play out that tactical on a given day. How am I going to use this power? Same thing with barbarians and raging. Same thing with pretty much any of these abilities that you have limited uses per day. How do I manage it? When do I whip out this ability? When do I try to make do without it? That's management has always been a big part in one way or another of the game. But when you're dealing with the concept that you have to sort of force your players to use them, that can become a challenge. In combat, it's fairly easy. You throw enough mooks at somebody, someone's going to rage, someone's going to do that, great. But those combats, one, they take a long time, and then maybe you don't get to other things that you want to do. And so in the end, you don't get them to really exhaust themselves, because maybe you threw them a big combat at the beginning, but if that combat in the beginning took the entire night to run, it didn't really do what you needed to do. The second one is, how do you prevent your players from resting and recouping all the time, which is another problem, is the kind of turtling up. We're going to do one encounter, then we're going to retreat back to town, we're going to rest overnight, we're going to come in and do the second encounter. And that's sort of a problem no matter what you do with encounters, but particularly if you have really heavy-duty encounters, you're going to be more inclined to let your players rest on them, which, again, kind of defeats the purpose of having multiple encounters anyway. So we want to have encounters. We want to have encounters through our day, but we don't want them all to be heavy-duty combat. So what does an encounter really mean when we're looking at this kind of action economy? We're looking at planning our encounters through the day. It's probably not helpful to think of an encounter as any scene, right? Because your players sitting in the tavern is not going to tax them in any significant way. We really want to think about encounters. Maybe we'll call it encounters with a capital E. And encounters are at least offer the potential for players to expend their resources. And in this case, by resources, I'm talking powers, abilities, things that they have limited uses of. So when we look at encounters in that way, not just a scene and not just combat, but some moment that forces players to at least think about using their abilities and powers, that's probably the most helpful way in terms of this economy to thinking about what an encounter is. So I'm just going to look here because I thought they had a pretty good combat encounter. Okay, so they get into combat encounters pretty quick. I thought there was another section here, but there is. Okay, so we want to think about things that are going to use abilities. So what might those things be? And this is going to be highly dependent on your party composition, because something that might be no challenge at all if you have a rogue or a bard might be very challenging if you don't, right? A locked door can be a challenge if it means it's going to cause a wizard to take and use a spell on, say, knock that they wouldn't have done otherwise. A high wall could be a challenge if you don't have rogues, you don't have people who have good climbing skills, and then you need to spend spells to do that. It's kind of more difficult if you have a bunch of combat-oriented characters. You're going to have to go into combat. I don't know offhand. Maybe there are uses for barbarian rages outside of raging in combat. If there aren't, then there's really no way to expend those besides getting into combat. But other things, particularly with spellcasters probably being the big one, and things like bards and bardic inspiration, is really anything that's going to force your characters to sort of come up with interesting solutions to the situation in hand, or at least tempt them, because we don't want to make it a slog, and we want to reward clever play. If your players if you can set up a bunch of challenges and throw in some combats in between them, and your players are cleverly able to squirm around those challenges without expending resources, you shouldn't ding them for it. That's a good thing. But as a GM, you just want to test them. You want to throw a big chasm in front of them and say, okay, find your way across. And if they can figure out how to do it without using the spells that you know that they have, or the abilities that you know that they have, and they could just find a way to do it, great. Then that's good on them. And when they fight something on the other side, if there's something on the other side to fight, then they earned every advantage that they got through being able to cross that chasm without expending their resources. If it took them a lot of different spells and things and twists and turns and whatever to get across, well, then the next combat and everything after that is going to be more difficult, and that's okay. You don't want to necessarily box them in. I'm not going to necessarily build an encounter just to, jam up my spellcasters, but at the same time, it's on them to figure it out, and I'm not trying to make a puzzle necessarily where there's one right solution. It's really onto their ingenuity, and if they can be clever and they can figure it out, fine. If it takes them longer and they can't, and they have to spend some of their resources, that's fine too. That to me is part of the sort of interesting play, right? Is, can you be clever? Can you take the resources you have and really spread them out? Can you figure out ways to do things? If you're going to use your resources in an interesting way, how do you manage everything? And then if you run low, how do you use your own ingenuity to overcome the fact that you may lack resources? You may be out of the spell that you would love to use in a certain encounter. So how do you go on without it? What do you do? Those tensions to me are the interesting things about playing these sorts of games. And so as a GM, as a referee, you want to create things to create those tensions. But you want to do it in a way that doesn't feel like you're just jamming them up. Like, you don't want to do something where it's like, oh, I want to make sure that they're starving in the desert, so I'm going to have this thing come in and steal half their food at the beginning. And I've seen these things come up on Reddit where someone will say, oh, I want to make sure that they're in this trouble, so I'm going to have this whirlwind come in. It's just going to destroy half their food. To me, that's not fun. That's not interesting. As a player, I just feel like the GM just came in and picked my pockets, right? To me, that's not a good thing to do. Yeah, I want them to use the resources. Yeah, I want to have that tension of kind of scarcity, but I don't want to do it in a way that seems that I'm being overly manipulative. I want the players to be able to be clever about it. Now, if I take that same idea of some kind of poisonous, Sirocco coming through the desert, and they have warning of it, and they have some idea what could happen if they get caught in it, and they have options to try to get out from it, then that suddenly becomes an encounter. that suddenly becomes something where they get to use their capabilities to try to figure out, okay, this thing's going to come. Maybe it's locusts, right? Some kind of huge swarm of locusts. These things get into our camp. They're just going to devour everything. So now how do we get away from it? How do we prevent it? How do we get out of the way? Whatever it is, how do we deal with this? Suddenly, that's, to me, is a good encounter. They've been forewarned. They know what the stakes are, and they have ways of getting out of the stakes, whether that's just running as far as they can, getting on their horses or whatever they do, and just getting the heck out of Dodge, whether it's, I don't know, burying things in sand, or whether it's finding some kind of cave, whether it's coming up with some kind of locust repellent, whether it's creating a giant flame and the flame will keep the locusts away. I really don't know, but these are the kind of encounters that you want to build. These are the ones that will sort of challenge the players, but not in a way that seems cheap, right? And that's something that the DMG does mention, right? These should be things that they know the stakes, right? It says under character objectives, it pretty much says that, hey, a transparent objective alleviates the risk of the players losing interest. What basically saying is, you have to know kind of what's at stake. If you know what's at stake, it will feel fair. You will feel like you have all the information that you need. You won't feel bamboozled when someone said, if the GM says to you, or the ref, or, oh, it's going to start snowing. Okay, I could deal with a little snow. And then it's a blizzard, right? It feels cheap. If it's a blizzard, you should kind of get some kind of warning, but if you get those warnings and the GM just tells you, hey, if you can just looking at the horizon, you can see this blizzard from the wind, it's coming in fast. You're going to have, even tell them what the things are. If you don't get out of this blizzard, you're going to get exhaustion. There's going to be a certain chance your animals freeze and die. All these things will happen. Then that gives them a real clear objective. We have to get out of this blizzard. And then if they decide not to, then they've made a choice and the consequences are clear and they have to live with them, and they should live with them. Maybe they feel like it's less important to get out of the way than just to bear through it and with their, gritting their teeth, and then keep going. And they don't care about their animals. They don't care about their supplies. That's fine. That's a choice. So those are the kind of encounters that you want to fill your day with. And obviously you can't fill your day with freak blizzards and sirocco's and swarms of locusts that are going to eat all your food. So you're going to have to get a little bit creative, and it's going to be very much, again, dependent on what your party is. Because one thing that might not be a challenge to a ranger, let's say if you're in the woods, or maybe a druid, or depending on how a bard or rogue is built, might be very challenging if you have a party full of fighters or, whatever, some other classes that don't have lots of outdoor stuff. So what might be a challenge to one party might not be a challenge to another one, but you're going to know your party so you can plan accordingly. So if you don't have rangers and druids and people who are outdoorsy, then just navigating through a space that's difficult could be a challenge. Getting across a hazardous body of water could be difficult. Could be, something that they need to, it could be an encounter in the sense of using up resources. This is a deep river that's flowing fast. There's rocks, there's rapids. How do we get across without getting hurt? Maybe there's a ravine and there's no bridge for miles. How do we get across? So these are all things that you want to look at and then use to challenge your group, to find ways to them to expend resources. And it's something that's creative, and I wish they'd spent more time, particularly on non-combat, encounters in the DMG, because those to me are more challenging. It's easy to throw a bunch of something at your party and just to let them slaughter through it and have them use up some of their, maybe short rest powers, or even maybe some of their long rest powers. But it's harder to do that and be creative when they're not combat oriented. Because how many times are you going to run into a locked door or a chasm or a high wall before it's going to feel like rote? It's hard to come up with those and be creative, but that's the challenge. Now, one thing you can do is you can combine a combat encounter with non-combat hazards, let's say, or challenges. So, for an example, in Lord of the Rings, when they're trying to get through the bridge in Moria, you have them going through these different hazards, moving along these corridors and through, the falling. I don't know, it's not really a bridge, but the staircase that's falling and all this stuff. And while they're doing that, they're being peppered by, arrows. So you could have, one party member trying to figure out which way to go, another party member maybe casting a spell to help people get across, some kind of a gap that's opened up, and then you have other characters that might be trying to peg, the orcs as they're coming. And then behind them, you've got this big Balrog, which, they can't really face, so that gives them sort of a ticking clock to keep moving. They can't stop and take out the orcs and rest and do all this stuff because the orcs keep coming and the Balrog's coming behind them, so they have to move, and that's one of, again, when we're looking to building multiple encounters in a day, it's that how do you keep your party moving? How do you make time important? Because any encounter, whether it's combat or non-combat, is not going to drain resources if your party can rest after each one and just recoup what they spent. If you can just keep using your short rest powers and then just immediately short rest, you're always going to be at full for the next encounter. And the way you do that is you make time important. And it can be difficult to make time important because modern D&D doesn't tend to value time in the same way that old editions did. And time was important in old editions, and I think I've said this in other videos, because you trigger random encounters, you would trigger use of resources like light, which were also finite. You trigger all these things that would keep kind of draining your resources down, and so you had this impetus to keep moving. In modern D&D, generally you don't have a lot of that management. Just about everybody has dark vision, or it's very easy to get dark vision or have a light spell or permanent light spell, so that really devalued sort of using torches and light sources like that. Additionally, they don't tend to have random encounters, though again, I'm here at the section where it talks about, hey, look, random encounters. But they're not as much a part of the core system as they used to be. It used to be a really core concept of X amount of time passes, chance for random encounter. X amount of time passes, chance for random encounter. And so you really had this in your head. Every time I spend some time to do something, it's almost like you're spinning the wheel, and that wheel's going to come up nasty at some point. So you don't want to spin the wheel too many times. You want to try to be as efficient as possible. But the modern game doesn't have that sort of same sense of urgency and efficiency unless you as the GM really create it. And so the example with going through Moria is a good one because it illustrates that ticking clock. You have something that's mean and nasty chasing you that you can't really beat, and you have to keep moving. Now, it doesn't have to be a monster, and often a monster can be a bad idea because a lot of parties, and I'm not going to speculate really why, but the modern players, I think, have a hard time running away from things. They're just sort of not conditioned to run. They're conditioned to, maybe it's because of video games. I don't know. Like I said, I don't really want to speculate, but it's whatever the reason that if there's this challenge here, it's meant to be beaten. So I think if Fellowship of the Ring were played with modern D&D players, they would have all died to the Balrog in the first part because they would have heard the Balrog coming in the giant hallway, and they would have readied up, charged at it, cast their spells, and then gotten whomped. It just seems to be, I think, the players that, it's just not part of their, not to say that nobody does it and you can't learn it. Of course you can. And you can change your habits and all that. But I think a lot of players, just out of the box, it's just a more heroic type of game where you expect that your players can overcome whatever odds are in front of them and do well in any particular encounter. Whereas, like for myself, coming from sort of old school gaming and coming from playing some very lethal kind of homebrew games, I'm always looking for the exit. Where's my route out of here? Where's my line of retreat? How fast can I turn around and get the heck out of Dodge if things look too tough? That's always how I'm thinking. I'm always thinking, like, how can I get out of here if I have to? But it can be something else. In my other examples, they had ticking clocks as well. If there's a storm incoming, that's a ticking clock. If there's a swarm of locusts coming, that's a ticking clock. It could just be night coming. If you're in a location and the players are aware that night it's super dangerous, maybe all kinds of vampire bats come flying out and chase you down, whatever. Something really nasty comes out. Maybe it gets super cold at night. Whatever it is that happens at night, maybe that's becomes a ticking clock. Maybe reverse it. Maybe you're in some kind of really hot location and during the day it's really bad and you have to wait for nightfall. But you have to find shelter. I think was it Chronicles of Riddick where there's the place it's basically just on fire during the day. Crematoria, I guess, the prison planet. The surface is basically on fire during the day, so you can only get there on the night side. So, you're trying to time everything to do things before they get back into back into their day cycle, because then basically just going to cause everything to light on fire. So these are all clocks you can use to kind of give a sense of urgency. It could be that if you're doing sort of a wilderness campaign and you're getting from A to B, that they need to get there at a certain time. Maybe they have to get somewhere before an execution. Maybe they have to save the prince before he's forced into a marriage. Or maybe they have to bring evidence before the king, before the evil vizier is able to use some kind of deception to gain power. Whatever it is, they're time limits. And so when you get to something that doesn't seem, or maybe it seems more innocuous, like, oh, here's a deep river, and we can't cross it, and to take away the option of just saying, well, we're just going to sit on it until I can get the right spell memorized, or, oh, we're going to go just walk down to town where there's a bridge and go over it. You can't, because if you take that long to do it, if you sit on it and you wait, or you go way out of your way, then whatever it is you're trying to do is going to fail. So you have to get across it now. And that will force parties to either be clever and come up with ingenious solutions, and part of that might be absorbing a loss of resources to get across now instead of later. And, the other part of it, or it does cause them to have to expend some spells, expend some of these finite resources that they have that can then give them that sense of scarcity that I think ultimately we want to have, because that's what makes sort of the chess match within the game interesting, is when you just don't have access to everything. So I hope this sort of helped enlighten a little bit about running encounters, or maybe not running them, but thinking about encounters in a broader way than just as combat encounters, which, again, I can't say for sure that this is what they intended. Maybe they intended all these encounters to simply be events with combat during the day, or during an adventuring day, I should say. But I think what we want to do as a referee is to find ways to get players to at least consider spending resources. And just to sort of recap, how could we do that? Put in obstacles, challenges. It could be even just optional things to explore. It doesn't have to be something directly in their way. It could be a little side quest. It could be something of interest, something that they have to risk. A risk and reward is maybe the best way to put the scenario, because what if it's a magic pool, and you want to, and in olden days, magic pools were something that always got interest, because they could either do really great things for you, sometimes they do really awful things for you, and you would try to figure out which one of those it was and who was going to take the risk of drinking from it or looking in it. And sometimes they had treasure at the bottom. These are all things you had to figure out. But it was something that would at least give you, as a player, you'd want to pause and maybe think about that. And that's another thing. It doesn't have to be something directly in your way, but it should be something that has kind of a risk reward, which, going back to the book, that's kind of what they're talking about, is you have an objective. whether that objective is something that directly relates to your quest, whether it's just an extra bonus, but there should probably be some reward. If that reward could be just moving forward, and it could be getting information, could be getting a little bit more than what you had, something that was maybe optional but helpful, could be finding an item, could be, getting something else online. Just has to be something should be something there that's worth investigating. Because if you throw a bunch of stuff at them and then they're at the bottom line, they go and they spend the things to solve it and they all come up empty, they're just going to stop solving it, and frustration is going to set in. So risk reward, use some kind of ticking clocks. Feel free to mix in combat to keep things interesting, or something else that will add some extra complications to it. If you find that you don't have a particular ticking clock in mind, enemies doing things can be a good way to get the players moving and thinking, and forcing them to address things that they might not. So we go back to the river example, and if you have to get across that river and you're being peppered by enemies on the far side of the river and you don't have anything to hit them back with, that's going to give you some extra impetus to do something, right? And particularly if you add the ticking clock, as we can't go around, we have to go across now, that is really going to force them into motion. So when you're thinking about encounters, don't think they have to be all one thing or all another thing. Mix in some sort of obstacle or objective with combat. Maybe combat can also be the fail state of an objective. It could also be, when you're talking about partially succeeding, that can also be maybe it's easier if you get across, but you can still manage it if you don't. All these different ways. And I think when you look at it in that broader sense, then maybe getting to 6 encounters doesn't quite feel so difficult. I still think it's a challenge, and it's one that doesn't have an easy solution. If you can't get to a number of challenges, you're going to end up wanting to throw things that are large at them to use up those resources, which can again be draining to play, and it can maybe not necessarily have the outcome that you want. But I think if you can shoot for creating situations that force your players to potentially use up the powers that they have, then you'll be going a long way towards creating the sort of scarcity that makes player decisions interesting. And I think that's what they mean by encounters. And so I hope that this helps when you're playing your game and you're coming up with things, kind of creating encounters. And if you like this video, please think about subscribing. I have a Patreon. If you feel like chipping in, that would be great. Otherwise, I will talk to you later.